All right, hi and welcome everyone. We're so excited to be starting our third week of the Siouxland Garden Show. So my name is Kathleen Brinkerhoff and I have Carol Larvik with me. So I'm with ISU Extension and Outreach and Carol's with Nebraska Extension in Dakota County. So I'm going to quick pull up our PowerPoint. So just a reminder for everyone to go ahead and join us in the comments. Let us know where you're joining us from and if you're a master gardener. We're so excited that we were able to kind of market this across the country. So we have speakers coming from Oregon, Pennsylvania, so all across the United States. So let us know if you're joining us from outside of our area. We'd love to know if you're a trained master gardener or if you just love gardening. So remember to continue joining us for all of our other sessions. We have 3 more weeks after this week, and we have another presentation this afternoon where we're going to learn a little bit about care of apple and cherry trees in the winter. So for all the information about our sessions, you can go to siouxlandgardenshow.org. And if you go under the speakers tab, you can learn a little bit more about each session and a little bit more about our presenters as well. Of course, this is a collaborative effort with Iowa State University Extension Outreach in Woodbury County and Nebraska Extension in Dakota County. So we have a Siouxland Garden Show committee that's made up of the 2 extension offices as well as some master gardeners that help us out. So we have a great team that's been working hard to put together our in-person shows as well as our virtual shows. So this is actually our 15th Siouxland Garden Show. So even though we're virtual, we're still celebrating that. So our team here is made up of Carrie King, Carol Larvik, Molly Hewitt, myself, Caitlin Brinkerhoff, Kevin Potabom, Emily Yockey, and then bottom 3 are our master gardeners. We have Rex Towns, Randy Burnnight, and Diana Kincaid. So it's been really exciting getting to plan all the garden shows with these folks. And back in September is when we had to make the decision to stay virtual for 2021. But we are excited to be going back in person in 2022. So we want to make sure that you guys can save the dates for our 2022 show. It's going to be April 2nd and April 3rd. So that's a Friday and a Saturday. So it's 2 full days for you to shop, learn, and grow so you can go visit some different types of garden vendors. We have a winter's farmers market. We have a children's play area. All kinds of fun stuff is out there. We're going to be at the Marriott Center in South Sioux City. So the same place we were at in 2019 for folks that came out. And our admission fee for that is $5 per day. But just a reminder, all of our virtual sessions this year are free. And if you would like, all of our sessions from last year are also archived. And you can find the link for that on our website. Of course, we want to say a big thank you to our volunteers and vendors. We have over 70 Master Gardener volunteers that help us put on this show. So we're so sad that we can't be together in person this year, but we love having you guys join us in the comments and watching all of our sessions and still getting to work with us in a virtual setting. And we're looking forward to being back in person in 2022. And then also for all of our vendors, we have usually over 40 vendors that come out and set up educational booths and provide all kinds of fun gardening materials for the Siouxland community. So definitely, if you haven't joined us for an in-person show, make sure to come out in 2022. It'll be fun to see you. Even though I've said that year so many times, I still get a little tongue-tied on it. Of course, we want to thank all of our wonderful sponsors for all the sessions that they're able to bring during the Siouxland Garden Show. These have been wonderful sponsors with us throughout all the years. We'll have them up in the left-hand corner for each one of the sessions. So definitely feel free to visit our website to learn a little bit more about our sponsors if you're interested. So a big thank you to Bloomers for sponsoring today's session. All right, and today we're going to talk a little bit about using annual and perennial flowers for curb appeal. So I am going to go ahead and take my PowerPoint off. Kathleen, I'm going to pop you on the screen with us here. Welcome, Kathleen.
Thank you. Glad to be
and I'm going to go ahead and get your PowerPoint up. And so Carol and I will go ahead and hop off, and the stage is all yours, Kathleen.
All right, thank you. So if we think of annual and perennial flowers and the color they bring to our landscapes, then we also need to think of them as resources. And regardless if you know, you have a lot of a budget to spend towards flowers or a small budget. There are things that we can do to use them to their best advantage. So that's what we'll be talking about today as we move through this. So, and now I'm not able to move things ahead. All right.
So we'll give you just a second to go ahead and kind of get that up. So you might just have to maybe take it down and start it back up again if needed, Kathleen.
Okay. And
so while you work on that,
we practiced this before we started and everything worked fine, and now it's not working so well.
No, that's okay. While we do that, I'm going to go ahead and just show folks where they can find some archived sessions. So I'll let you kind of play with that for just a second.
Do I do the stop sharing first, Caitlin?
Nope, I went ahead and pulled it off screen, so you are all good on your end.
Okay.
Oops. Oh my gosh, technical difficulties all around, huh? And if needed, Kathleen, I do have your PowerPoint ready on my end if we need to pop it up.
Okay.
So folks, you can find archive sessions on the Siouxland Garden Show website page. If you go underneath the speakers tab, you can click any of the sessions that we have already done if you've missed any, and then you can jump on there to find the archive sessions. So they're listed under each presenter. And if you go down further on the page, you should be able to find the archive sessions from 2020 as well. So if you haven't seen any of those, or if you're new to the Siouxland Garden Show, you can definitely check those out. If this is your first time joining us for the Siouxland Garden Show for this year, go ahead and put that in the comments, where we'd be very interested to see.
It shows it's sharing now.
Yep. Once you have it popped into presentation mode, Kathleen, I'll be able to.
There it is. All right, let's see if I can advance now. Awesome. Okay.
Oh, okay. There you go.
So a lot of times when I'm talking about this, I like to talk about the why behind things. And since I'm assuming that I'm talking a lot to gardeners here, we know that the number one reason is that it beautifies. But there are other things that color that flowers bring to the landscape show for us as well. And one of those things is it invites interaction on our part. So in some cases, we want to bury our nose in a flower to smell the fragrance. We may want to look at the butterflies or the native bees that are visiting those flowers. Or in the case of things like lamb's ears, you know, we want to touch that foliage just because of that softness that's there. So it really requires us to be interactive with those plants. And so it's a level of detail that really is best utilized in places of traffic. And so it doesn't really make sense to make something really showing, really beautiful at the far reaches of the front yard, so that nobody coming to the front door, nobody walking on the path by the sidewalk that's in front of the house. If there's not chances to interact with it, then people tend not to interact with it. And so that's where the placement really comes into play. Plants, and in flowers in particular, can literally guide people through a landscape. So you've seen this before, you know, it's kind of iffy where the front door is on a particular house and you don't know quite how to navigate to that. There are visual cues that flowers provide that can pull us through a landscape to the designated place. And then the fun thing is that it influences mood. So a very quiet landscape can give us more of a somber mood, while you can also get some really fun things that excite you. You can show, you know, different seasons of the year, all of those kind of things when it comes to what flowers bring to the landscape. And then finally, from the curb, our front door is the real focal point of any landscape. And so what it can do then is it can focus that attention at the front door. So again, so not only do you know where to go to the front door, but it also makes the travel to the front door more inviting. There are 5 elements of design that fit into all aspects of landscapes and how we use them when it comes to fitting into those elements. So massing is, well, let me just go on to that, okay? So massing is the idea that we put plants together. And if there was, one idea that I could translate to you in how we approach landscape design is that it's very much a mimicry of what we see in nature, in the forest, in the overstory, in the prairie. So we have overstory plants. So we have the large trees, the medium-sized trees. We have the understory consisting of smaller trees, large shrubs, small shrubs, and then we get to the small plants, and that's where we have the tinier shrubs, lots of our perennials, and even some annuals thrown in. And that's all replicated in what we see in the forest area. So in the image on the left, you can see we have a really good development of the idea of massing. Plants put together, they work together, they're cohesive, they're compatible. Whereas the image on the right here, you can really see that there's not a good development of massing. Really, each plant is meant to be a specimen and viewed in its own right. And so those things in the right image really don't do a good job of making a cohesive whole. And so that's a very poor example of massing. Then we go into the idea of form. And form is really about what kind of shape the plant contributes. So notice I'm not talking really about anything in flower color right now. We're really talking about the foliage of the plant, what kind of shape it takes. And just like in containers where you can have, a spiky, rounded, and trailing plants in that container to really spark our interest, the same is true in our landscapes. And so in this particular one, you can see that we don't have a lot other than mounded type forms contributing to this front curb appeal. We do have a little bit of spikiness associated with the evergreen that's here and a little bit with the hostas with their spiky flowers that are in bloom right now, and then a little bit of the yellow celosia that's at the front door. So there's all different kinds of forms, and really to make it most interesting, it's nice to include all those things. And so here we have an example of some really good interest that's sparked by a range of different plant forms. And notice they're not all in bloom. Some things are in bloom, but not all of them are. And so what that interest in the foliage does, in the plant form does, is it really carries the landscape through when those plants aren't blooming. Next, we have line, and the line refers to a lot of different lines in the landscape. So we could be talking about the architectural lines that are associated with this, where we're just talking about the lines of the house, the roof line, the vertical lines, the horizontal lines associated with the like the foundation and those kind of things. And notice that there's not a lot blooming in this particular image, but what the mounding of the sweet potato vine really does is it softens those architectural lines. And then we have probably one of the best design tools that we have in our toolbox of different things is the line that occurs between the turf area and the bed lines. And so when you're massing things correctly, then you can have some really interesting things that are going on between the massed areas and the turf areas. And line can be curved lines, it can be straight lines. And one misnomer that I encounter quite often is that the idea that line being straight really adds harshness to a landscape is untrue, because really what happens is plants soften that. And so you can use straight lines to good effect and not be afraid that you're really making the lines worse in a landscape. So keep that in mind too. Then we have texture, and it's a really cool thing in that, we have our fine textured things through our small leaves, our small flowers. If something's real shiny in texture, that's another form to add to it. Or you can have softness with like lamb's ears. And so there's a lot of different ways we can add some really fine texture. And that's represented really well in this container just with the lantana flowers that are here. And then you have the coarser texture of the large leaves here of the begonias. And so you can see that we have, both large leaves and then the large flowers. And also if you have a real rough textured plant in a landscape, that can draw people through a landscape as well, just through that mix of textures. So again, a mix of textures is a really good concept to utilize, especially because plants aren't always in bloom all the time. And then another really good design tool is the idea of color. And I've included the color wheel here just for your usage if you want to look at this and revisit it in the future. And there's a lot of different things to make note of here. So we have the primary colors, which consist of red, blue, and yellow. And then when you mix each of those colors, then in between you come up with the secondary colors. And that's where we come up with green, violet, or some people know it as purple, and then orange. And so those are the primary and secondary colors that we work a lot with when we're doing design. And when we look at the red to yellow range on the color wheel, we're talking about hot colors, colors that really grab our eye. They're vibrant and they really grab our attention. And in those instances, when we have lots of those colors in a landscape, there's two more colors that are important to include as well. One is just a plain green area. So you need an area where maybe something isn't in bloom at the time, and that really provides a resting place for the eyes, okay? And then white also forms the same function. And so if you have white flowers in that landscape, it's going to really help to give your eye a place to rest when you're viewing these really hot colors. Then on the other side of the color wheel, we have what we call the cool colors, and that includes the violets to the blues and the greens. And those are the colors that are more of a calming color. They don't necessarily draw our attention to the degree that the reds, oranges, and yellows do, but by any means, they certainly draw our attention as well. Then we have the idea of monochromatic. Monochromatic is things where, say we start with the color red, okay? Then with that, we will add just a little bit of black, and that's where we come up with dark reds. And then with that same original red, we add more white to come up with pink. So we have pink, red, and dark red. That becomes then our monochromatic color scheme. And we see that in landscapes all the time. Okay, then also we have complementary colors, and those are ones that are directly opposite on the color wheel. And the reason that we really like them is they create a contrast that's really pleasing to the eye. The colors are really sharp and they contrast with each other nicely. And so it's no accident then that we have red and green across the color wheel from each other that we associate with like Christmas time, because those colors are opposite on the color wheel, okay? Analogous color schemes is usually 3 colors that are all next to each other on the color wheel. And we see that used a lot in landscapes as well. Then there's the square idea. That's where we have things that are roughly the same distance from each other. So we'd have violet, orange, then we could have yellow and blue, and that's a square color scheme. And then I always like to include things where anything goes. We'll see all kinds of colors in a single landscape, and there's nothing wrong with that either. There's certainly something that has to be said for that. And those landscapes are going to be really important that we utilize some of those areas to really provide places for our eyes to rest. So an area of green or an area of white flowers is really important. Okay. So here on the left, we have a really great example of complementary colors. We've got the purple of the Verbena bonariensis coupled with the yellow daylily. And so those are complementary colors. And again, keep in mind that those are things that really complement one another, and hence the name complementary. And when we're aiming for a complementary color scheme, we wouldn't separate these two. We would have them next to each other in the landscape to reinforce one another. And then on the right here, we have just some really light shades of pink and a little bit of white. And so this really fits more into a monochromatic color scheme. Then there's focal points that we can have in our landscapes that really are about green more than any other color. And so I wanted to stop just a moment in our contemplation of color and talk about green, because green is a little bit odd in that in wintertime, that's when green as a focal point becomes very much dominant. And that's because it's a little bit in rare supply during that time. So mostly when you think about winters, we're thinking of lots of snow cover, or if there is no snow cover, we're talking about lots of browns and tans. And so when we have those greens, like included in our evergreens, that's when we really focus on those kind of things. If there's a patch of snow that's melted from the front lawn and you can see that patch of green lawn, that's when green really becomes a focal point as a color. But as we move into the growing season where there's lots and lots of green everywhere, that's when it really becomes a background color, and it really showcases the other colors that it has in front of it. And so things that are blooming with a background of green really show up nicely during that time period. And if you doubt that color is an important thing of green in that landscape as a background, just think about the plant that's called naked ladies, or some people call it resurrection lily, the one that sends up a bunch of foliage. That foliage dies in the spring, and then it sends up flowers in August. Okay, a lot of people find that absence of greenery around those flowers really wrenching. So in those cases, it's really nice to include something green around it. And so that's an indication then of just how important green is as a background color. So let's talk a little bit more about the things that flowers bring to curb appeal. Okay, and we know that beauty is paramount because we like it. It makes us happy. And so on the image on the left here, it's really very muted colors. One little tiny container, a little bit of a grouping of something in bloom right here. It's really not happy. It's really not as welcoming as, say, the image on the right here. So with all of the things that are going on color-wise, it's really about the beautification, making us happy, drawing us in, making us interact, that really lends itself to curb appeal. And remember what I mentioned earlier about how sometimes, color can really act as a guide? Well, here we have a really good example of, we have a big magnolia that's really obscuring the front door. I'm sure it does some nice shading of the house, and it provides some privacy when, there's really a close curb here, so there's street traffic. But in those instances where that occurs, it's nice to provide some visual cues so that people walking onto the property for the first time know where the front door is. And this tiny container here really doesn't do the job. And so there are things we can do to draw people through. Okay, so what I want you to make note of in this image on the right is that there isn't direct access to this porch and the front door from the street. Okay, those visual cues are that there's no sidewalk, there's these boards that are going along the front porch here. There's really not anything to say to you, here's where you come in, except there's these grouping of flowers. So there's a huge border here, but the concentration of color is near this area where you can actually get into the porch and hence to the front door. And so really what the flowers function here as is a pull. It's a draw through the landscape to draw people where sometimes it's not clear where to go. But these very simple composition does a really good job of pulling us there. Okay, now Color can also stop you in your tracks, right? Maybe not necessarily a good way. So in this case where it's kind of anything goes, we have lots of pots that are going up along here, and oh, this Rebecca decided to seed itself into the crack of the sidewalk, and we're just going to leave it because we like flowers. So in some ways, it can say, stop where you're going, don't go any further, but by golly, we're going to make you smile while you do that. So flowers, the color they provide can do some really powerful things in a landscape. Okay. Flowers also act as reinforcement. So in this case where we have a front door, we can replicate some of the colors that are in our landscape to reinforce that focal point as the front door. So not only do we have, you know, the mailbox here, but we also have the flowers in the lavender. We can have the hyacinth bean. We can have the containers. We can have the trim around the windows, the window boxes, all reinforcing the color that's used at the front door. So color is a really powerful thing that can be used as reinforcement. Okay, here we have not such a great example of color as a reinforcement. And it would be better in this particular instance if the homeowner had utilized massing to their best efforts. So maybe pulling out these daylilies that are in these raised beds and pulling all of these plants into a larger massing in the front of the landscape to really utilize massing to the best of its ability, and then using maybe annual flowers for their bright spots of color in these raised beds. And so that would again reinforce the landscape. And here we have another example of some really beautiful colors that really our eye follows, and it goes right up to the front door. So again, color can be used as reinforcement. So when we're talking about what annuals and perennials bring directly to a landscape is in particular curb appeal. Okay, and when we separate out the two plants, we need to look at what they bring specifically. Annuals bring more of a constant color. A lot of us know that they can produce flowers pretty much all growing season. As long as it's frost-free, you're going to have something of color when it comes to annuals. And perennials are a little different in that, you know, we're looking at how they bloom at different times of the year, and then it's more of an orchestration of color. And that's where the foliage that is associated with those perennials become even more important. So in this case, we have some perennials that are utilized. Some are in bloom, some aren't. But really what they do is reinforce that front door. They really add to this landscape in all of the ways that I've already mentioned about. And while the image on the right has a lot of annuals associated, those annuals are concentrated at the front door so that continuous bloom really draws us in. Okay, so most of our perennials are about 2 weeks of bloom. And so when there's not much in a way of blooming as far as additions go, you can have a pretty bland landscape. And so the image on the left here, we can see that we have lots of things that aren't really blooming right now. And this particular ground cover that's right here next to the sidewalk could easily be replaced with just a bit of color, like some annuals, again, to draw people in. And the image on the right here, unfortunately, the purple flowers that are here get lost against the color of the house. But also you have this really strong artemisia with this really strong grass component in the back of it, and just the start of some sedum blooms that are really, again, orchestrated to bloom so that they really enforce that area, that space, and they're masked well as well. Okay. So annual flowers, you know, the really great thing is, again, they provide season-long color. And so we can put these at points of interest. So window boxes, if you're looking to have some curb appeal, they do a lot of good there. With this fall blooming clematis, maybe just the best point from the perspective of, you know, if you're backing out this driveway, there may be something that's hidden behind there, like a small child on a tricycle. And so that can be a concern. So in this particular composition, I think I would have skipped the clematis in favor of, just doing the rudbeckias, the zinnias, and the salvias, and just calling it good. Okay, so that's pretty much it, all I have for you. You're welcome to ask questions if you'd like. I didn't see any questions pop up during the course, but I can certainly revisit those now.
Yeah, it looks like we don't have any questions right now. We'll go ahead and give a little time to get some questions in here.
Okay.
Thank you so much for that presentation. I'm going to try to share my screen again, and hopefully I don't have a weird little glitch again, so I can start showing folks a little bit about what they can find on the Siouxland Garden Show website page. So if you guys go under the speakers tab, if you click any of these sessions that we have had before, you can find the archive sessions. Renee's session, we weren't able to save, but she has a lot more presentations coming up about Preserve the Taste of Summer. So if you're interested, you can feel free to hit that Contact Us page if you missed Renee's Preserve the Taste of Summer, and I can let you know a little bit more about her sessions coming up. And if you scroll down, you can find all those sessions from 2020 if you want to look back and visit any of those presentations. So I believe we had 16 last year. And then also for today's session, for the evaluation, you can find that underneath Kathleen's speaker tab here. So if you go into that, you can find the evaluation link. So you can click on that and it will take you directly to the evaluation. So we welcome your feedback. I am going to go ahead and pop that in the chat for you as well. It looks like we did get one question in. So we're going to go ahead and pop that up on the screen here. It's any suggestions for plants for fall seed heads?
Any suggestions for plants with what? I'm sorry.
For fall seed heads.
Oh yeah, there's tons. I mean, all of the ornamental grasses fit into that category. And also think about plants that turn fall colors. And one of those is Amsonia. They turn a beautiful golden color in the fall. So does balloon flower. The foliage turns a beautiful golden yellow. So that's way foliage can give you some really neat things. And then a lot of the annual flowers that are great for dried arrangements. So the Gomphrena is going to be a really good plant that holds on to its color a long time. You're going to get some really pretty colors that you can harvest off there or just leave in place to provide you some season-long color. I also like the interesting seeds of blackberry lily. It gets its name from the fact that when the pod breaks open and curves backward, there's a cluster of black seeds that look very much like a blackberry. And that's beautiful as a dried flower that can continue in the landscape. If you let those seeds drop to the ground, you'll get more plants, or you can cut the seed heads off and use them in dried arrangements. So there's a lot of cool things that you can use that really up the ante, so to speak, in that you can get some colors that are associated not just with the flowers themselves, but the other things they contribute, like seed heads and foliage.
We have another one here that is, do spring perennials make good cut flowers, like irises?
Do spring annuals that make good cut flowers? Was that the question?
Spring perennials.
Spring perennials that make good cut flowers. Irises, yeah, absolutely. There's peonies are great spring perennial. Those are kind of the big ones that a lot of people think of. Let me think about that a little bit more. The Amsonia makes a great cut flower that I had mentioned earlier. It's also called Blue Star, real starry bluish white flower. Very nice, makes a good cut flower. I'll have to think about that one a little bit more. Maybe we could put it in the chat later or something. I don't know, Caitlin, but there's a lot of things that you can add to that. And that's probably an important consideration, that there's a lot of things that do the bulk of their blooming, like in June and July. That's when tends to be our peak months. But a lot of times when we're looking at things that bloom better in the spring, we're looking at those classics like the irises to really carry the garden through during the growing season.
Looks like we have another one here. Says, can you talk a bit more about scheduling bloom, like putting annuals in front so that the color is in front all the time?
Yeah, so really it's about using the annuals to the best of your ability. So if annuals are a resource and we want to make the most of that resource, the foremost place that we're going to put it is near the front door because of that continuous bloom that you get through the growing season. But it also, if you have a bigger budget or if you're growing lots of annuals from seed, then there's other things that we can utilize where we're using it around perennials to maybe carry that perennial grouping when there isn't things in bloom right then. So annuals work really well to that effect. And most of our annuals, when we look at the form of those plants, they run in the medium to short range. But there are some taller annuals, like there's some tall zinnias, there's tall cosmos that can be integrated further into the perennial border that work really well. The downside of it is as those perennials are developing that foliage in the spring, they're developing robust foliage. And so they can literally shade out their annual counterparts. So that's where having a designated space that they get off to a good start right away, where they're getting lots of sunlight and they can really grow, is going to be beneficial. But if that isn't a possibility, then it's about more of boosting those perennials in that particular area and then utilizing the annuals more as a front of the border sort of thing. Okay. I will be the first to tell you that when the catalogs or the plant tag says when they bloom is highly unreliable. And that was just part of my master's degree when I was working on it, was just looking at plants that bloom better in August, because I noticed that August really had nothing to offer, or very little to offer as far as something of interest during the growing season. And so in an effort, I started creating a tally of August plants that bloomed really well. And that particular bit of information is on the Iowa State website. But also there's some things that you can do to really boost that curve appeal when things are quieter. And again, that's through foliage, seed heads, all of those kind of things. So really it's about utilizing those plants to really make them shine.
Awesome. And I do want to acknowledge we have so many new folks that are joining us for the Siouxland Garden Show that these virtual sessions are some of their first ones. So thank you so much for joining us. Got another one here. It says, when you need to revamp part but not all of the flower bed, can you talk about the pros and cons of taking the bed out or working around existing plants?
Yeah, absolutely. So when you're revamping a bed, it's nice to leave some plants in place so that when you add the new things, it doesn't look like a brand new bed. You've got that continuation of space holding that occurs from well-established plants. But sometimes, you just need to divide perennials. And in those cases, there's two different ways you can do that. You can just take your spade and cut away clumps and leave the parent plant in place. Or you can dig up the entire plant, cut away the parts to share with friends or neighbors, and then put back a portion of the plant. And when you do that, you need to cut any of the things that you put back in place or the things that you're sharing with the foliage by half, cut the foliage back by half, all right? That way, with the limited root supply that you've just created by digging that plant up, you give the plant more options in order to reestablish, okay? So there's lots of stored sugars in that root system. They'll reestablish the root system, but to try and support all of that foliage on the top is really hard to do, and you'll end up with collapsed plants. And I know that's kind of hard because sometimes we want to see the flowers from the get-go, and that's just not going to happen when we move things. So you can do that. The other option you have is waiting until those plants bloom. And then once they're done blooming, then digging up that plant, doing your division and putting it back in place. And that's another way to minimally invade on that space and make it look, really chopped down and cut back. It's a way to have something holding the space while things are going in place. So, and as we all know, perennials need division at all different times. Some may need dividing in 3 years, some may need it in 5 years. Grasses, ornamental grasses, seems like they need it almost every third year. So it just really depends on the perennial. So you can certainly opt to do that phasing in of doing it right after they're done blooming or something like that.
And this one says, I planted a rhododendron plant in front of my house last year. It looks pretty lonely. What can I add around it?
Yeah. And there it's going to be really important that you add other plants that like really acidic soil conditions, because rhododendrons do best around a pH of 5.0. And most of our Midwest soils don't have that kind of pH. And so that means you're going to be adding things like aluminum sulfate or iron sulfate to the soil to bring that pH down. And if there are nearby plants around it that don't like that low pH, then you'll have some plants that are always unhappy. And so it's really about choosing plants that like those conditions. So you can do things like boxwood. That's, things that like it that low pH wise are just going to be really tough. So it may mean that, you just plant the boxwood, or not the boxwood, but the rhododendron, and have a few trailing annuals underneath it and count that as a grouping and leave it at that, just because it's going to be really tough to get everything so that everybody's happy all the time.
And another one that says, do you have any suggestions for reliable resources to visit to help design a landscape? Resources that give good details about shade and sun requirements, plant heights, colors, etc.
I would recommend both the Iowa State and the Nebraska Extension websites for that information. Nebraska Extension has a really good NEB guide. It's called Plants for Shade Locations. And it's an extensive plant list of both annuals, perennials, shrubs, vines, trees that all do well in that understory of shaded areas. So that's a really good publication. Then the Iowa State has a really good design publication that you can print off that has a grid pattern so that you can do some of that landscape planning on paper first. And it has a lot of these concepts that I talked about today with that, so that you can kind of guide yourself as you go through it.
And Kelsey, I will go ahead and find that landscaping publication, and Carol, I'll have her track down the other one, and we'll make sure to pop those in the comments so that you have those resources for you.
Great, thank you.
It looks like that might be all for right now. I'm going to go ahead and just quick pop Kathleen's information back up on the screen. So if you have any additional questions that come up, or if you're visiting this recording later on, you have her information there. And then also just a reminder to go ahead and fill out that evaluation. There's also a section for you to put in any additional comments, and we can get you in connection with Kathleen as well. Looks like we have one more question before we end. It says suggestions for native plant landscaping.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful question. Thank you for asking it. The thing is that native plants for the longest time had this reputation of being scruffy, unruly, not pretty, and we know that to be untrue. And the Midwest is, the plains states. We have lots and lots of native plants. The prairie plants, the wildflowers are absolutely beautiful, some of them. And they're not all these tall things that are 6 foot, 7 foot tall, like big blue stem or Indian grass, although those are pretty and I have a place in the landscape as well. There's things that are medium and short that do really well. Nebraska Extension has a really good neb guide. It's called it's called Wildflowers, Native Plants for Sunny Locations. And there's a great list there of some native plants that do really well in our landscapes. I'm also a big fan of a lot of the native grasses, big blue stem, little blue stem, prairie drop seed. Prairie drop seed's one of my favorite just because of the texture of the foliage. But also Indian grass. I mean, there's just a lot of cool grasses. And one really exciting thing that I like to see is that there are more and more different plant research groups that are doing releases into the trade that feature native plants. So one of those is the Plant Select program out of Colorado, and then the Nebraska Statewide Arboretum in Nebraska has some really great releases they've made of native plants. So those are two locations that are going to really tell you about some of the up and coming things or things that are old standbys that you really want to revisit. So lots and lots of places to get native plant information.
Yeah, and I would love to just let you know too, Benjamin's talk last week was talking a lot about planting natives in your landscape and kind of if you wanted to do that native front yard kind of look. So if you want to go back and visit his archived session, we have that on the website as well. And he does talk a little bit about different types of natives that you can put out. And then also if you visit the ISU page for Extension, we do have some information on natives as well. Locally, we do have the Les Hills Wild Ones chapter that has been promoting a lot of native plants, and they actually have a plant sale that's going on right now too. So if that catches your eye and you're in the Siouxland area, maybe check them out too.
Yeah, and the really cool thing about all of this interest in natives is just, you know, they're wonderful soil holding capacity, so they make good things for rain gardens. A lot of pollinators really appreciate the flowers, both the pollen and the nectar that our native flowers provide. We know that native plants are used to periods of wet and periods of dry, so they're highly adaptable to the Midwest. And so they just make a lot of sense to utilize those plants.
And then for the folks watching, we did put the 2 links to those publications that Kathleen referenced in the chat. So you should be able to find those both on YouTube and on Facebook if you guys wanted to see those. But I think that's all we have right now. So I'm just going to put a little reminder out again to fill out that evaluation that's in the comments for you. And a reminder that we have another session coming up at 3 with Steve from Oregon State University Extension, and he's going to talk a little bit about winter care for apples and cherry trees. So we hope to have you guys join us at 3 p.m. Central Time. Again, all the information is on the website as well as Facebook. So thank you so much for joining us, Kathleen, and we'll see everyone later today.